سلام عرض میکنم خدمت بینندگان گرامی. امروز در خدمت آقای دکتر عبدالله عواد هستیم از دانشگاه هاروارد و کمبریج که مهمان ما هستند در پژوهشکده سیاست‌گذاری دانشگاه شریف و به میزبانی آقای دکتر هادی ساجدی از دانشگاه باقر al-Olum. از اینجا به بعد جلسه زبان انگلیسی خواهد بود. من پیش هم معذرت خواهی میکنم بابت تأخیری که در نشست به وجود اومد و قابل توجه بود. انشالله که کیفیت نشست بتونه این تأخیر رو جبران کنه. سلام علیکم. Hello to all our audiences. Today it's my great pleasure and honor to host Dr. Abdullah Awad, a visiting fellow at Harvard University and a senior scholar at Cambridge University. He has been he is the founding director of the Institute for Critical Thought, where he convenes seminars on Islamic and Western social thought. And as a visiting fellow at Harvard University, his research traverses intellectual history, continental philosophy, and religion. He has undertaken ethnographic work in China, India, Brazil, Egypt, and lectured internationally on education and social sciences, and also currently an executive board member of Baqir. Salaam alaikum, Abdullah.
Wa alaikum salam.
And our host, Dr. Hadi Sajedi, assistant professor of Baqir al-Olum University, Qom. Hello, Dr. Sajedi. I pass the floor to Dr. Hadi Sajedi to guide the session and to have the lecture of Dr. Abdullah Awad.
Yes. Thank you. In the name of Allah, the all compassionate, the all merciful, I'm so happy to join you in this very good session, which is titled under Islam as Sociology, History, Theory, and Practice. This is Dr. Seyed Hadi Sajedi from Baqir al-Olum University, a university which is a pioneer in social and Islamic studies. And we have different international activities here, and this session will be very beneficial for me as an associate professor of this university, and also our lecturers and students who will participate in this session. I don't want to take much time, and I'm so eager to hear Dr. Abdullah Awad, founder director of Institute for Critical Thoughts. And I will be available during the lecture for Q&A or any help that I can serve to the audience. Thanks again. Listen to the lecture of Dr. Abdullah Awad, please. Thanks.
Very gracious invitation. And thank you also to Dr. Ali, who is joining us from a different city. It's my honor to be here. And as much as I have ideas to share and personal experiences with which we can discuss and grow together, I also am here to learn and to hear your questions, and hopefully to have the Q&A be a substantive part of the conversation, so that I can respond more fully and substantially to the questions which may emerge. Mm-hmm. As those before me have said, I'm the founding director of the Institute for Critical Thought, but that designation starts from the end, and I'd rather go from the beginning. So I want to share a little bit more about my personal story and how it led to changes in thought on a personal level, and then how that transformed later into a new kind of institution. And hopefully through that personal journey, we can begin to reflect on the kind of work we can do between the West, the Arab world, and Iran. Before beginning, though, I want to begin with the first slide, if that's okay, which is a slide that describes the title of this lecture, which is Islam as Sociology. Now, this may be a strange way of formulating a topic within the social sciences and within policy specifically, simply because usually Islam is always seen as the object.
Yeah. Is it okay? Is it? Do you have the sound now? Okay. Okay. Yeah, you can
Is the sound
continue.
okay?
Yeah, yeah.
Shall
The technical problems.
That's
solved.
okay.
Okay.
Shall I start over or shall I keep going?
Do you want to start over? Okay, no, we can continue.
Okay. So I'd like to begin. I'd like to begin by briefly describing the title of the lecture itself, and I want to do so because it may seem unusual for a lecture in the social sciences and for a lecture on social policy specifically to think of Islam as sociology. Usually, the case is that Islam is the object of sociological inquiry. Islam is the object of social policy, of international policy, of public policy, even. And what that history has shown us is when Islam is an object of thinking, it's no longer able to speak in its own terms. And because the terms of social science and sociology specifically have largely been dictated by Western conceptions of the world, by Western conceptions of identity, of religiosity, of the public sphere, we are no longer living a society which stems from our own indigenous, our own Islamic ways of knowing. And so for Islam to be seen not as the object, but as the subject of the conversation, we're shifting the terms of debate. So that's just a note on the first word of the title, Islam. I also want to briefly talk about the second major term, which is sociology. Sociology historically has been the study by Western society of its own Western constitution. And now this is largely to ignore the history of sociology within the Islamic tradition, and namely the writings of Ibn Khaldun, which have largely informed Western conceptions of sociology. So by allowing Islam to speak back to sociology, we're not only shifting the terms by which the West understands social policy and sociology at large, we're also remembering something within Islamic history that has largely been forgotten because of modernity. And finally, I just want to say that what I'll be doing now is kind of taking you on a personal journey of how I came about opening this institute that's described here, how I came about as a thinker to be here sitting with you in Tehran today. So I'll begin, and if that's okay to go to the second slide, with a course I taught in 2016 called Islam and Critical Theory. And to reach this course, I want to begin with how I grew up. I was born in Amman, Jordan, and I went to high school there. And in my society, as it is, I would imagine, in societies in much of Iran as well, there's always an encouragement for us, if we get good grades, to pursue engineering, to pursue medicine. And indeed, today we're housed at the Sharif Institute and also at Sharif University, which is a university known for its technical excellence. It's known for producing some of the greatest scientists, the greatest engineers who go on to upend the industry in Iran and also contribute as academics and industry makers all around the world. And while the Arab world, the Islamic world, and Iran specifically is in need of great technical excellence, we also need to remember the other part to education and the other part to creating society, which is knowledge. And what I came to realize growing up is despite all the pushes from my family for me to study engineering and medicine, those two vocations always left me asking other questions. Yes, one could study medicine and become a doctor and treat people. Yes, one could study engineering and build things and reconceptualize materiality. But I had questions about life. I had questions about belonging. I had questions about the relationship between my history and my upbringing and the westernization of countries like Jordan. And so I initially turned to philosophy. And philosophy is a very, vague, large term within which there are so many different disciplines. But that's what I wanted to pursue. And at the time, the United States had offered scholarships for people in my position to study philosophy. And so I took a scholarship. I continued my undergraduate and later my master's and PhD studies between the US and the UK, thinking that what I wanted to do was study philosophy, that discipline that allowed us to ask questions and negotiate. But what I realized in my time in the US and the UK is that even philosophy has been skewed towards a Western history. And so I took leave from my university studies at the University of Cambridge in order to explore philosophy and history and literature, not from the perspective of the West, but rather from an Islamic perspective. So I asked for leave from my scholarship. I went back to Jordan and I held a public seminar. And the public seminar was an attempt to gather people who were in a similar situation to me, who weren't only interested in technical vocations, but who also weren't interested in simply repeating the ways in which the West has created knowledge in philosophical, humanistic, and social scientific terms. So there were a group of us who didn't really fit within these two categories. And so this initial seminar was the opportunity to build another kind of institute where we take seriously the importance of non-technical skills like the humanities and social sciences, but we do it in our own terms. So part of that has meant calling upon the very rich history of Islam in order to recuperate and remember its sociological, humanistic, and even theological elements so that they may bear upon everyday life, so that they may bear upon questions of policy, questions of social cohesion today. So before you is a slide called Islam and Critical Theory, which is a course in which I try to understand the ways in which Islam can be seen as a resource for critical theory, which is a reversal of how critical theory is often used to criticize Islam for whatever veiled or unveiled Western agenda or purpose. By 2016, I had given 3 seminars at the Institute and slowly transformed it into a center for knowledge, teaching, and research. And what we've done in the past 5 years is grow the Institute towards a global bi-program in which a program in English and a program in Arabic is available from students who come from all around the world. And the topics range from religion and theology, and if we could go to the next slide, to literature and politics. So a course I recently developed out of our research program is called Kafka Goes to Palestine. Again, we have a reversal of roles. Kafka is usually seen as a Jewish or Western writer who is often taken up by the West as being a paradigmatic figure of modernity. And what we did in this course is we tried to see how elements of Kafka's work are actually speaking to something as extraordinarily different seeming as the Palestinian question. And so how is it that even a European thinker or writer like Kafka could be seen as a resource for thinking seriously about a political problem in Palestine that's related towards the freedom of the Palestinian people, as well as the attendant issues of Islamic minoritization in the Middle East and Europe? I want to briefly talk about another course we've developed in relationship to our public policy programming called Ethics in Exile, which is on the next slide. This course brought members of government to take a seminar with members of the public in addition to refugees. So we had a minister in the Jordanian government sitting on the same table as a refugee who had never completed high school. And both of them read political texts, social scientific texts, religious texts, to try to understand how exile, the condition that is affecting millions of people today in Iran, as well as in the Arab world, how it could be reconfigured from an ethical perspective based on an Islamic perspective. And this is something that largely governments aren't necessarily doing simply because public policy has been oriented by Western conceptions of humanitarianism, by Western international aid, and so on. And part of what I'll be talking about in the second lecture today, titled Progressive Policies in the Islamic World, is one very specific project that the Institute has worked on as an effect of this course, in which we tried to create new policy paradigms based on Islamic ways of knowing in order to cope with the increase in refugees within Jordan. And I think here there are comparative ways we can understand the Iranian context. The next few slides show the diversity of our students and our members. So our members have come from all around the world. They come from the US and the UK, from major research universities, but they also come from more interesting places like South America, specifically Colombia, Hong Kong, India. The beauty of the Institute's perspective is that it doesn't see our addition to knowledge as being simply related to Islam as a particular identity. We think of Islam not in terms of the nation or in terms of the individual, but in terms of a world life system that's capable of speaking to the world as a whole. So those who have had different upbringings, those whose national identities don't necessarily relate to Islam, still have so much to learn from the rich history of Islam that we're trying to uncover. And I think that gets at the heart of how the Institute operates critically, given its name, the Institute for Critical Thought. We want to think beyond the silos and circumscribed identities, which are often Western conceptions of religion. I think Islam, as well as the major traditions of the pre-modern era, have a lot to teach us beyond the individual and beyond the nation. And I think these are the ways of knowing that we're trying to celebrate and which Iran is known to be so rich for as well. I want to show a few more slides from our Arabic program because I think it gets at the heart of what it means to go back to our roots. And this is something we can think also comparatively about with Farsi and the very rich history of Islamic philosophy, theology, and poetry in the region. In fact, some of the Arabic texts that we teach at the Institute are translated from their Persian context into Arabic. So the next slide is our first program in Arabic. It was called Kitabat Huwiyya. And it's an attempt to think about how we can write identity in Arabic, but with a broader Islamic perspective. The course after that also takes many Persian and Farsi resources. It's called Al-Fahm fi Dhil, Understanding Under Conditions of, the best translation would be of shadows. And it's about two thinkers, Al-Hallaj and Ibn Arabi, who are really phenomenal Sufi mystics, but who also had profound treatises on society, culture, and philosophy. And it's these ancient texts which often seem to be no longer able to speak to us, which we try to animate and reclaim for the modern moment. And finally, the last slide is the description of our course, Al-Uzla wal-Alam. And this can be roughly translated to isolation and pain. And this course in particular was a chance to think about difficulty and pain from an Islamic perspective that allows us to assess their value for reconceiving of identity in the modern context. In this regard, these kinds of courses are aligned with an indigenous form of sociology in Iran, principally articulated in the writings of Ali Shariati, who borrowed elements of Karl Marx and elements of Islam to try to create a critique of capitalist society and how it changes and reorganizes our ways of life. And so this last course was a critique of the ways in which sometimes we pursue pleasure and we pursue superficial commodities at the expense of going inwards and deeply trying to articulate who we are. And that finally takes me to the relationship between the individual and the institution. So this is what I want to focus on for the last few minutes of my talk, and hopefully use this as the springboard for a longer conversation within the Q&A. If we could just show the very last slide, which is the logo of the Institute. What I have seen in the past 7 years as I grew the Institute from a single seminar to a full throttle program in Arabic and English for research and teaching is that often many people, whether they be dedicated to the technical vocation of their choosing, or whether they're dedicated to the humanities and social sciences, they know that something is wrong with the way the world operates, be it at a personal level, at a social level, or at a national level. I think we live in a time in which the catastrophes before us are so enormous that we lose sight of how we can change ourselves first and later society in order to confront them. What I've seen in Jordan, what I've seen in the US and the UK, what I'm slowly beginning to see in Iran is that people across the spectrum of their religious identities, of their socioeconomic class, of their relationship to mobility, are dealing with crises of identity. It is no longer clear what kind of inheritance we are dealing with, given the distractions of modernity, given the ways in which nationalisms demand of us a certain kind of allegiance, given the ways in which our complex interiority gets categorized into separate, discrete identities. So these are larger problems that we face all in our own ways. All I want to say is that my experiences in the past 6 or 7 years have shown me that it's possible to translate that disillusionment, that feeling of lack, that inability to create something into the proper institutional channels. So I believe that institutions can be reconfigured, both at the level of civil society, which is where most of academia is, but even at the level of government, which is where a lot of policy work is done. And that we need to be attendant to the extraordinary number of problems that we face individually and slowly widen the circle of how we approach them. So what I ask of you, indeed what I challenge you to do, is not to ignore those issues that you know deep down in the bottom of your heart you are facing as an individual, that your family may be facing, that your immediate society may be facing. I challenge you not to put those things on the side in order to engage superficially with the tools that are given to you, whether it's through academia or policy or society. I urge you to bring those issues to the fore and to creatively and critically grapple with them. The output of that may be an individual output. Absolutely. But it also may be transformative. It may lead you to building partnerships with institutions beyond Iran. It may lead you towards pathways of inquiry and discovery that you didn't necessarily think were possible. And I urge this not only for those already within the humanities and social sciences, but also and maybe especially for those who have pursued technical vocations, especially members of this great university, Sharif University, because you are some of the brightest, some of the cleverest people in Iran who have gained acceptance at this university. But at the same time, I worry that the vast creativity and intellect that you possess will only go towards reproducing technical knowledge. And that takes away from the ways in which our intellect, our creativity can go towards creating new forms of knowledge, which can then mediate and better direct our technical capability. So I'll leave it for there. And I will mention, as a kind of point of departure for opening up a conversation, for inviting you to have a conversation, whether now in the Q&A or later, if you'd like to contact me through email or visit the Institute in Jordan, should you pass by, is that one element that we have lost collectively as a modern society is the basis of knowledge in friendship. And this is something that I've begun to appreciate more and more as I delve into pre-modern conceptions of knowledge production, especially in the golden age of Islam, of which Iran and Persia were an important part. And what I mean by the basis of knowledge in friendship is that if we think of knowledge not as a technical thing, if we think of knowledge beyond its utilitarian or instrumental value, we begin to see it as deeply human. And if knowledge is deeply human, then the ways in which it's learned and the ways in which it's shared are also deeply human. And thus the foundation for knowledge and exchange has to be some kind of friendship in which there is sincerity, in which there is compassion, in which there isn't the kind of, obtrusive ways of speaking that only want to challenge, that only want to critique. And here I'm reminded of a number of sayings by close friends of mine who say that there is no learning without there being friendship between the teacher and the student. And that's something that I believe in fully. So in the spirit of this friendship, in the spirit of this, inshallah, collaboration at multiple levels between Iran and Jordan, between the Institute for Critical Thought and various institutes in Tehran, I invite you for a conversation about any element that piqued your interest in this lecture, and for us to be in touch, throughout the next period as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Abdullah.
You have my sound?
Yes. Yes, we have your sound.
Yes.
You can continue.
Very good. Thank you. That was very interesting for me, Dr. Abdullah Awad. I have two questions, or let us focus more on two issues. The first one, you spoke of the identity and Kitab al-Huwiyya, the book of identity for a Muslim, especially in modern time. I want to ask you about the extremist Muslims who in fact send a different picture of Muslims to the world, a violent picture, and which is really very far from the reality of Islam, which is focuses on rationality and also on peace. So instead of sending the message of peace, love, and rationality to the world, such kind of extremist Muslims or terrorist activities, which we can say the Muslims who are victim of such terrorist activities are more than non-Muslims. So we are more angry than the others on such people. So that refers to the identity of the Muslims, or how we describe, how we define, and how we draw the identity of the Muslims. I wanted to know your opinion on this issue, or how can we avoid from such extremist pictures of Islam. This is the first point. And the second one is about knowledge in Islamic Ummah, Islamic society. I want to say that we have different opinions how to have an Islamic science, or should we get the same Western and secular knowledge, and only by omitting some parts we can have an Islamic version of knowledge, or should have a more fundamentally change in what we have. There are some ideas which insist on a gap or a different elements of these two, Islamic knowledge and secular or modern knowledge, because the secular knowledge is based, or it's better to say secular sciences are based on some principles which are far from Islamic principles. For example, some ontological principles. If you believe that there's no other world rather than this one, this material one, so this principle for sure affects on how you manage your knowledge, and in the way of moderate researches. In anthropology, for example, if you consider the man as a spirit of God, as a picture of God, gives you a kind of knowledge. When you get or you believe that human being is a machine and works as a machine, works for maximum benefits, for example, this understanding of human being or these anthropological principles gives you a different knowledge. Also in ethical principles or in epistemological principles, if you believe that the sensory knowledge is the only reliable knowledge, and you reject other kinds of knowledge such as revelation, intellectual knowledge, or intuition, so in fact you are limited yourself to only one kind or one part of knowledge. But if you believe in other kinds of knowledge, and you believe that revelation also gives you certainty and can gives you knowledge, science, a real, shows you reality, so for sure your knowledge will be in a different picture. Also, I wanted to know your opinion on this issue, which related to the difference between secular sciences and Islamic knowledge. Thanks again. Listen to you.
Thank you so much. I mean, those are two really complex and important questions. So I'm happy to share a few thoughts for either one. For in terms of identity and how Islam has often been construed as a religion of extremism by certain Western narratives, in which certain elements of Islam are taken out of context and interpreted by, as you said, extremists. And as you pointed out, often more often the case than not, the victims of these terrorist attacks are actually Muslim rather than non-Muslim. So I think that's a serious issue, and I think there's many efforts on the part of civil society and government to promote a kind of moderate Islam that values the central tenets of peace, the central tenets of rationality, and of cohabitation with other people. So I think that's absolutely the case that certain identitarian movements within Islam have been extremist in their interpretation. But I think in addition to problematizing their interpretation of Islam, it's also useful to frame their actions within global power dynamics. So I think for many of these groups, Islam is simply the vehicle for expressing political, but also political economic resistance to effects of imperial intervention, be it by the UK historically, by the United States after World War II, and also by the Soviet Union and Russia during the Cold War. I think because so many people who had been living in predominantly Muslim countries were the effect of such terrible colonial and imperial violence, sometimes their way of responding back is through this radical interpretation of Islam. So I think whenever it comes to a conversation about extremism and terrorism, I make 2 points. The first is that these forms of extremism are not necessarily responding to Islam in its identity. They're extremist, they're radical, they're misconstruing Islam. They're using Islam for their own political, economic, and sometimes personal gain. So that's the first point I would make, as you made it so eloquently as well. But I also would stress that within a global dynamic, we need to understand the ways in which those movements are responses often to the greater violence and the greater extremism of Western, particularly Anglo-American, imperial and colonial rule around the world. So if we want to critique the extremism of a group in Afghanistan or a group in Iraq, we also have to critique the extremism of certain Western governments that have devastated, exploited, pillaged those contexts that then produced that kind of resistance in the name of Islam. So that would be kind of the main response to your first question, and the implied assumption as well that Islam is really a religion of peace and cohabitation, and that we need to promote this kind of rationalism is absolutely something that I agree with you on, and that we need to advance at all levels of society. So those are my thoughts for the first question, and please let me know if I've missed anything in your question that still needs responding to, or if you want to continue that conversation about identity and Islam. The second question about the differences between Islamic knowledge and secular sciences, I also really appreciate that question, and I appreciate how you called Islamic knowledge knowledge and secular sciences sciences, because I think that distinguishing way allows us to better appreciate how knowledge is sometimes more than merely a science. Science has a specific connotation in contemporary society as being reproducible, material, substitutable, and so on and so forth. And all these material connotations don't reflect the much more expansive and capacious understanding of knowledge within the Islamic context. As for the question of what to do, whether indeed there is a gap between these two fields, whether we ought to use elements of secular science while still trying to grow our own indigenous Islamic knowledge, I think that's a very difficult question to answer in the abstract. Because regardless of how I or anybody else answers this question, so much of our lives, even in places slightly removed from the West like Iran, so much of our lives is still within or enveloped by modern Western sciences. Everything from our relationship to technology, our relationship to economy, even our relationship to governance is largely the byproduct of a European nation-state framework that was then globalized in the past 100 years. And its globalization has led to the necessary configuration of certain scientific modes of governance. So I think because we're so entwined within this modern Western scientific paradigm, it's hard to remove ourselves completely from that paradigm. So I think my answer is for us to strategically work within it in order to build an alternative form of Islamic knowledge. And the reason I've paid so much attention in my talk to the role of the humanities and social sciences is because I think these are really important starting places for doing the work of building and popularizing and expanding Islamic knowledge, so that one day we'll reach the threshold where that Islamic knowledge is capable of responding to the uniquely modern issues of governance, of economy, of policy, of education, and so forth. So in short, my answer is it's hard to escape necessarily the issues of modern science, but at least we can start building towards a threshold for Islamic science, for Islamic knowledge, to become the replacement feature of our society. And that's very difficult, very complex work that we need to attack and grapple with at multiple levels. So I think everybody has a responsibility in their own sector to begin doing this work. So if you're a researcher, if you're a professional, if you're a policy analyst, I think everybody has something to do in relationship to that growth. And I think what you've listed, all the very affective ways you've listed the differences between the sciences and the Islamic knowledge is really profound. When you think about ontology, epistemology, intuition, revelation, framing the question in these terms, I think, is powerful because it connects to everybody, regardless of whether you studied, Islamic knowledge or not.
Thanks, Dr. Abdullah. That was great. May I continue the discussion on the second issue, or if we still wait for other participants for any new question? If we receive any question, and the participants are welcome to send us their own question. But to continue and have a time for receiving new questions, let me add a point to yours, Dr. Abdullah, which is about, as you know, the term of Islamization of knowledge became very famous in Islamic Ummah for some decades. And many of scholars or scientists work for a kind of Islamization of knowledge. But recently, some of them, or even we can call most of them, understood that Islamization of knowledge wouldn't lead us to what we are aiming for, because we should think for establishing Islamic knowledge on principles of on Islamic principles. When we are speaking of Islamization of knowledge, in fact, we accepted the whole version of the secular sciences. We only want to change some parts which has obvious conflict with Islamic teachings. Rather, if we want to think of a kind of Islamic knowledge, before everything, we need to start from the principles. And as you also explained about epistemology and intuition and other kinds of sources for knowledge, I believe before we claiming for any kind of Islamic knowledge, we need a kind of drawing the Islamic principles. And according to those Islamic principles, and also about the division of knowledge. As you know, this kind of division among the disciplines, which is famous in the world, and also UNESCO has accepted such a division for knowledge and sciences, as there are some conflict between the current version of this division and what we are searching for. For example, in Islamic knowledge, there's a focus on human and the responsibility of human being and the role he has as the abd of God, the servant of God. For sure, human has responsibility to take benefit from nature, but at the same time, human being has this responsibility toward the nature. When you forget your responsibility toward the nature and look at the nature only as a source for money, for power, for pleasure, for sure you cannot pay nature's rights. So this is only an example how we consider the human and the relationship between human and the nature. So in brief, I wanted to say, in my opinion, we first of all need to focus more on the principles. If you draw a good relationship between human and the nature, then you can pay the rights of nature to it. But when you believe that you are the owner of everything in this world, and you only want to take benefit from the natures and look at the nature as a source of power, as a source of money, then we see the crisis of environment in this world as all the people accepted such great crisis which happened for the nature and also for the life of human beings.
I think you put it so eloquently. I think that's absolutely the case, that many of the catastrophes we witness today, be they social, be they personal, be they environmental, are the result of the ways in which Western sciences have always created disciplines that separate one element from another. So profit is separate from ethics, and man is separate from nature, and so on and so forth. That's led us down towards this specialization that has no longer made the world part of who we think we are. And so we exploit it without thinking twice. We divide our labor without thinking twice. And just as nature loses, we lose, because part of what it means to be a human being is to be whole with the world. And what we have done for the past 200 years, beginning in the West, but now through globalization everywhere, is we keep cutting ourselves into parts. And that has led to everything you're describing. So I absolutely agree about these crises. And I absolutely agree that we need to reconfigure knowledge from within Islam to become such that it's based on Islamic principles. I also agree that the Islamicization of knowledge presupposes, as you said, that we've already convinced ourselves that this knowledge is right. And what we rather should do is begin with the principles themselves and then cultivate the knowledge out of it. I think another term which people often use, which falls into the same trap as the Islamicization of knowledge, is the decolonization of knowledge, because it's also a reactive step. Whether it's in academia or even in civil society, it's often just reacting to a form of knowledge or to a colonial practice. Whereas in fact, as you pointed out so well, we need to actually be building from principles, not just simply critiquing how the colonial principles fail. And I think that's a crucial entry point for building new kinds of institutions, which begin with Islamic principles and aren't necessarily tethered to all of the problems which came before.
Many thanks to you again, Dr. Abdullah, for your good explanation. I believe the time is over, so if you want to be on the program, the first session is up to the end, and we haven't received any other questions from the participants, and that maybe showed the discussion was very clear, or any other understanding of it. But I believe since the time is over for the first session, we should call off this session and let's give the time to Dr. Abdullah for a rest. Then the second one will start after 30 minutes. And I believe this is the last word. We listen to the last word of Dr. Abdullah and call off this session and wait for the second one. Thanks again. I say goodbye to the participant and also to Dr. Abdullah, and listen to his last words and explanation on this topic.
Thank you so much. I primarily want to thank you and to thank all the organizers for having me and for hosting me and for this incredibly rich conversation. I think my biggest takeaway is the importance of continuing these conversations across national boundaries so that we can cultivate ways of thinking, but also to cultivate actual research practices, actual institutional partnerships that take these conversations and transform them into work, that transform them into curriculum for teaching. My students in Jordan, my students in the UK would love to have you as a speaker so that they could hear a perspective which isn't necessarily prominent within the Middle East and Jordan and within the UK. And in that spirit, I also want to stress the importance of building South-South collaborations, which is to say building these conversations and partnerships without the mediation of the West. And I think what's so valuable about this set of programming and what's so amazing about the Mustafa Prize is that it's building an alternative to the Western hegemonic process of how knowledge, be it in the natural sciences or in the social science, is transferred. So I thank you again for making it possible for this kind of South-South relationship to begin. And I look forward to building it with you. And if any participants or attendees are interested, I can have the programmers share my email so that we can keep the conversation going. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor. For sure, we shall be in contact for more discussions, for more working together and collaboration, inshallah. Thanks again, and have a good day for today. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody, for attending our session, SPRI event. Thank you, Dr. Abdullah.
Thank you.
And I want to give special thanks to Mr. Seyed Majrai, our studio administrator, always supporting these SPRI events, but never mentioned his name. And goodbye, everybody. We will come back half an hour later, inshallah.
Inshallah.
Rest